CNN's Tom Foreman is here to walk us through what we're hearing from federal officials, but also what the videos show, including the new videos, because what they are saying and what the videos are showing are not always the same thing, Tom.
Yeah, very much. I want to start with the very first statement made by the Trump administration in the aftermath of this shooting. It was a tweet by the Department of Homeland Security showing a firearm on what appears to be the seat of a car. And the tweet reads, an individual approached U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, seen here. You see the picture behind it there. This looks like a situation where an individual wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. Now we have this new angle of the video that's just been cleared by CNN, and it shows the lead up to this deadly altercation. This is what I want you to take a look at. Of course, this is disturbing video.
This kind of political shift rarely announces itself with speeches or votes. It begins in quieter places, inside procedural calendars, inside draft legislation, inside assumptions that everyone involved believes are stable. For weeks, Washington operated under the expectation that the Department of Homeland Security would be funded on time, that disagreements over immigration, enforcement, and border policy would remain contained within familiar partisan lanes, and that the annual ritual of last-minute compromises would once again prevent a shutdown. Nothing, at first glance, suggested a rupture. The machinery of government appeared to be moving, if not smoothly, then at least predictably. Then Minneapolis entered the picture again. Not as a policy debate, not as a press conference, but as a reminder of how quickly federal authority becomes personal, visible, and irreversible when force is involved. A second shooting involving federal immigration enforcement did not immediately change votes on Capitol Hill. There was no instant collapse of negotiations, no dramatic walkout from budget talks. Early interpretations treated it as another tragic but isolated incident, destined to spark statements, calls for investigation, and then fade into the background noise of a divided Congress. At the time, this didn't appear decisive, but American politics has a way of storing unresolved events, of letting them accumulate weight quietly until the structure above them begins to strain. What looked procedural soon revealed itself as something else entirely. The issue was not only the shooting itself, but what it symbolized for lawmakers who had already been uneasy about the direction of immigration enforcement and the expanding discretion granted to federal agents. The second incident in the same city disrupted the narrative that these were anomalies. It suggested a pattern, or at least the risk of one, and patterns are where institutional anxiety begins. Inside Congress, the DHS funding bill had been treated as a technical necessity rather than a moral battleground. Funding Homeland Security meant funding border operations, disaster response, cybersecurity, and immigration enforcement all at once, bundled together in a way that historically forces reluctant coalitions to hold. But this time, the emotional context shifted. Lawmakers who had been prepared to vote yes, or at least not vote no, began re-evaluating what that vote would signal. Not just to constituents, but to themselves. Early interpretations often miss structural meaning, and this was one of those moments. As outrage grew outside Washington, something subtler happened inside it: silence. Meetings continued, but language softened. Statements were delayed. Questions about accountability, oversight, and agency culture began surfacing in closed-door conversations. The funding bill itself did not change, but the political environment around it did. And in Congress, environment can matter more than text. What looked clear then would later seem incomplete. The Senate, always more sensitive to procedural leverage, became the focal point of this shift. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Without bipartisan support, the DHS funding package could not move forward. And support, once assumed, was no longer guaranteed. The issue was no longer whether DHS should be funded, but under what conditions and at what political cost. Blocking the bill did not require a majority willing to shut down the government, only a minority unwilling to proceed as if nothing had happened. This is where the situation took on a different character. A shutdown is often described as a failure, but institutionally, it is also a tool. It is one of the few moments when inaction becomes action, when refusing to move forward forces a confrontation that normal legislative processes avoid. For some lawmakers, allowing DHS funding to lapse, even partially, began to look like the only remaining leverage available. Not because they wanted a shutdown, but because they believed the system would otherwise absorb the shock and move on unchanged. What made this moment particularly volatile was timing. Budget deadlines do not wait for investigations to conclude or public trust to be rebuilt. The calendar kept moving, even as confidence stalled. Historically, decisions like this tend to expose fault lines that were already there. Immigration enforcement, executive authority, and federal accountability have long been unresolved tensions in American governance. The shootings did not create those tensions, but they forced them into the foreground. And yet, even as rhetoric sharpened, uncertainty remained. No one could say with confidence whether this standoff would end in a compromise, a temporary extension, or a partial shutdown. What mattered wasn't what was visible in public statements, but what was shifting underneath them. The realization that DHS funding was no longer just about numbers on a page, but about legitimacy, trust, and the acceptable use of federal power. This was not yet a crisis. It was a hinge, a moment when routines began to falter, when assumptions lost their grip, and when the consequences of inaction became as politically potent as action itself. And this was only the beginning of how it would be understood. What followed was not an explosion of chaos, but something far more unsettling to institutions built on routine: hesitation. In Washington, hesitation is rarely neutral. It signals recalculation. As the days after the second Minneapolis shooting passed, the tone inside the Capitol shifted from quiet concern to strategic discomfort. Lawmakers were no longer debating policy outcomes in the abstract. They were debating what kind of responsibility Congress bears when federal power produces irreversible harm. That question does not fit neatly into an appropriations spreadsheet. The Department of Homeland Security sits at a peculiar intersection of American governance. It is simultaneously operational and symbolic. It manages borders, disaster relief, counterterrorism, and immigration enforcement, but it also embodies the post-9/11 expansion of federal authority, an authority justified by risk and sustained by urgency. Funding DHS has often been treated as a necessity too dangerous to interrupt. That assumption has held through controversies before. But assumptions, once cracked, rarely return to their original shape. Inside the Senate, the debate began to reorganize itself around leverage rather than legislation. There were no sudden ideological conversions. What changed was the perceived cost of cooperation. For Democratic lawmakers already under pressure from constituents demanding accountability, voting to advance DHS funding without concessions started to feel less like pragmatism and more like complicity. At the same time, Republican leadership framed any delay as reckless, warning that border operations, emergency response, and national security would be undermined. Both arguments were institutionally rational. That was the problem. Historically, moments like this tend to expose a deeper conflict between two models of power. One model prioritizes continuity above all else, arguing that government must function even when imperfect, especially in areas tied to security. The other model insists that continuity without accountability erodes legitimacy, and that disruption is sometimes the only mechanism left to force reform. Neither side believes it is choosing chaos. Each believes the other is normalizing risk. As negotiations continued, the structure of the funding bill itself became a silent antagonist. DHS funding was bundled, meaning that opposing one component meant threatening the whole. This bundling has long been a feature, not a bug, of congressional strategy. It discourages dissent by raising the stakes of objection, but in this case, it also magnified the moral pressure. Lawmakers were no longer deciding whether to fund an agency. They were deciding whether to allow the system to pause in order to signal that something had gone wrong. What made the situation more volatile was the narrowing margin for procedural maneuvering. The Senate calendar was unforgiving, and leadership on both sides understood that time was becoming a weapon. Delays were no longer just delays, they were choices with visible consequences. Each day without agreement increased the likelihood that DHS would lose funding authority, at least temporarily. And with that possibility came a familiar but dangerous narrative: who would be blamed? Blame, in shutdown politics, often matters more than outcome. Lawmakers began positioning themselves not only for the vote, but for the aftermath. Statements grew more careful, framed around regret rather than resolve. No one wanted a shutdown, but several were prepared to let one happen. That distinction is subtle, but critical. It allows responsibility to be displaced onto the system itself, onto deadlines, onto procedures that left no other option. Meanwhile, the White House found itself in a constrained role. Executive pressure can sometimes force a compromise, but in this case, overt intervention risked reinforcing the very concerns driving resistance. Calls for unity rang hollow against images and accounts that continued to circulate from Minneapolis. The administration could urge calm, but it could not restore trust on demand. And trust, once shaken, does not respond to deadlines. What emerged instead was a standoff defined less by ideology than by institutional identity. Senators were being asked, implicitly, to choose between protecting the continuity of the federal apparatus and asserting congressional oversight in a moment of public reckoning. That choice does not resolve cleanly. It lingers, creating space for delay, for brinkmanship, for outcomes no one formally endorses, but many quietly accept. This is how shutdowns approach. Not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a slow convergence of incentives where standing still becomes easier than moving forward. The second Minneapolis shooting did not dictate this outcome, but it altered the terrain on which decisions were being made. It changed what votes meant, what silence implied, and what compromise would cost. And as the funding deadline drew closer, one thing became increasingly clear. The question facing Congress was no longer whether DHS deserved funding, but whether the existing rules of governing could absorb another shock without consequence. That question had no easy answer, and the system was running out of time. By the time the possibility of a partial shutdown became explicit rather than theoretical, the underlying conflict had already moved beyond the Department of Homeland Security itself. DHS was the vehicle, not the destination. What Congress was now confronting was a question it repeatedly postpones until events force its hand: how much institutional disruption the system is willing to tolerate in order to reassert democratic control over federal power. Historically, shutdowns are framed as failures of governance, moments when politics overwhelms responsibility, but that framing assumes that responsibility is singular and uncontested. In reality, responsibility in this context pulls in opposite directions. On one side is the obligation to maintain continuous government operations, especially in areas tied to security and emergency response. On the other is the obligation to respond when those same institutions lose public legitimacy. When these obligations collide, the system has no elegant mechanism to reconcile them. If this pattern continues, the immediate consequence would be a partial shutdown that affects DHS functions unevenly. Some operations would continue under existing authorities, others would slow or halt, and the public impact would be confusing rather than catastrophic. That ambiguity is precisely what makes shutdowns politically survivable and institutionally corrosive at the same time. They allow leaders to claim restraint while normalizing dysfunction as a bargaining tactic. The deeper consequence, however, would not be measured in days of closure or furloughed employees. It would be measured in precedent. Each time Congress allows a shutdown to function as leverage rather than as a red line, it rewires expectations about how accountability is enforced. Oversight becomes conditional, urgency becomes negotiable, and the public learns, again, that structural reform is most likely to occur only when something breaks. This moment also carries implications for the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch. DHS, more than most agencies, operates with broad discretionary authority, much of it delegated over years of crisis-driven legislation. If Congress ultimately funds the department without extracting changes, the message is clear: operational continuity outweighs behavioral correction. If it withholds funding long enough to force concessions, it signals a reassertion of legislative authority, but at the cost of normalizing disruption as the price of oversight. Neither outcome is clean. That is why this moment feels unresolved rather than climactic. Lawmakers are aware that whatever happens next will echo beyond this budget cycle. A shutdown framed around immigration enforcement and federal use of force will not stay confined to DHS. It will shape future standoffs involving law enforcement, surveillance, and national security agencies whose powers are similarly broad and whose accountability mechanisms are similarly strained. There is also a political risk embedded here that extends into future elections. If voters come to see shutdowns as routine expressions of moral protest, their shock value diminishes. If they come to see them as reckless brinkmanship detached from reform, trust erodes further. In both cases, the institution loses ground. The danger is not that government stops working for a few days, but that citizens internalize the idea that it never quite works as intended. What makes the Minneapolis shootings so central to this narrative is not only their tragedy, but their timing. They occurred at a moment when the federal government's role in immigration enforcement was already under scrutiny, when public patience for abstract assurances was thinning, and when Congress was once again facing a deadline that tests its capacity to act decisively without defaulting to crisis. These events did not create the dysfunction, but they illuminated it. If Congress steps back from the brink at the last moment, as it so often does, this episode will still matter. It will have reshaped internal calculations, hardened positions, and demonstrated that certain assumptions about automatic funding no longer hold. If it does not, and a partial shutdown occurs, the lesson will be sharper, that in the absence of trust, even the most essential institutions become bargaining chips. Either way, the system is being asked to absorb another stress test, not one imposed by foreign threats or economic collapse, but by its own unresolved contradictions. The contradiction between power and accountability, between urgency and deliberation, between continuity and legitimacy. Moments like this rarely resolve the questions they raise. They clarify them, and clarity, in politics, can be destabilizing, because once the lines are visible, pretending they are not becomes harder. The path Congress chooses in the coming days will not settle the debate over DHS, immigration enforcement, or federal authority. But it will signal how willing the institution is to confront those debates without waiting for the next crisis to force its hand. There is no definitive ending here, only trajectories. If this pattern holds, future funding fights will arrive, carrying more than fiscal stakes. They will carry unresolved moral ones. And each time, the cost of postponement will rise, even if the immediate crisis passes.